Prime Minister David Cameron's subsequent resignation have plunged Britain into political turmoil as the country tries to cope with the new situation. Infighting within the opposition Labour Party has reached new highs over a leadership contest. Most Labour lawmakers have voted to withdraw support for their party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. In a secret ballot, 172 Labour MPs, or 80% of them, voted that they have no confidence in Corbyn and want him to leave before the next leadership vote. But the non-binding vote doesn't mean that he has to step down, and that has prompted Labour members to want to find an exit solution.
The Parliamentary Labour Party that called for his, that had a secret on a vote of no confidence, have really shown themselves to be a spineless bunch of careerists and completely insouciant of the wishes of the members. They didn't really take them into account.
Labour Deputy Leader Tom Watson is seeking to agree to a negotiated settlement with Corbyn, asking him to step down voluntarily. A shadow cabinet is also trying to convince him to retire with dignity rather than being ousted in a leadership election, which many refer to as a coup.
It's him thereafter, and the reason they're after him, as far as I can tell, I really am puzzled at the depths of their vitriol, is that he has stood for principles and they haven't. And his mere presence there is a total reproach to them, because they have been part of a machine that was designed to ignore the members, to ignore the unions, and to ignore the people who have voted Labour for many years. They knew best, they thought, and that's what they're demonstrating now.
According to Labour Party sources, around 60,000 new members have joined the party over the past week. Corbyn supporters and opponents in the party have been trying to recruit members to vote in a contest to either support or oppose him. As pressure from within Labour mounts, Corbyn has rejected all calls to quit his post as leader, saying he has popular support and believes that resigning amounts to betrayal. Recent polls in Britain suggest that Corbyn would easily defeat his likely leadership challengers, and there's little support for any alternative candidate. According to a recent YouGov poll, Corbyn would defeat Tom Watson by 50 points to 39, Angela Eagle by 50 points to 40, and Dan Jarvis by 52 points to 35. Many believe that Corbyn's opponents are acting now because they know that the upcoming National Executive Committee elections will deliver a more pro-Corbyn slant.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, former British MP George Galloway out of London, and also former British MP Derek Conway out of Newcastle. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in London with George Galloway. Some observers and grassroots supporters of Jeremy Corbyn say a coup attempt has been staged against him. Do you agree?
Well, there's no doubt about that. The only question is the timing. The embittered Blairite rump have never accepted the election of Jeremy Corbyn. He came out of nowhere and won an overwhelming victory just 9 months ago, and they have never reconciled themselves to that fact. They have been planning this coup from the day and hour that he was elected, if not even before, when it became clear that he was going to be elected. But the problem for them was that Corbyn kept on winning. There have been 4 parliamentary by-elections in the last 9 months, and Corbyn won every single one of them with an increased majority. Labour won the London mayoralty, they won the Bristol mayoralty, they did better in the local elections than they had done the previous year under the previous leader. So no pretext was presenting itself. And then, as you rightly implied, the imminence of the Chilcot inquiry report on Wednesday, providing the likelihood of the complete and final discrediting of Blair and his acolytes, this panicked them into moving now.
Okay.
And with the benefit that all of this disruption takes the mind away, creates a smokescreen to try and obscure the view, the ugly view that will emerge undoubtedly, from the Chilcot report on Wednesday.
Okay, stay with me, Mr. Galloway. Stay with me, Mr. Galloway. Let me get Mr. Conway in on this discussion. Why is it that the Labour MPs want Jeremy Corbyn to step down, but the rank and file supporters of the party want him to remain as the party's leader? Why is it this schism exists?
It's an odd thing, because it's not just the private grief of the Labour Party. George will remember that when David Cameron became leader of the Conservative Party, the majority of Conservative members of Parliament actually voted for a man called David Davis to be their leader. But the party in the country voted for Mr. Cameron. So the Tory MPs just sort of knuckled down and got on with it. And in the Labour Party, the vast majority of Labour MPs, 172 of them, have decided we're not going to knuckle down and get on with this, and 40 of them have voted to support Jeremy. I think where George is probably slightly egging the pudding, as we say, going a bit on, is that this is not just about a Blairite rump, because clearly many of the 172 Labour MPs, many of those who resigned from the shadow cabinet, were not avowed Blairites. I mean, it's a useful tag to hang it up on. And I'm a bit conflicted about all this, because as a Conservative MP for 25 years, it's obviously good fun to watch the Labour Party imploding. And I think if Jeremy Corbyn survives, and like George, I mean, I've known Jeremy since 1983 when we entered the House of Commons together, and I think he's a good man, a principled man. I just don't think he's capable of leading the Labour Party to victory. And that's what frightens those MPs, because they can see much of their active political career being spent in the wilderness of the opposition benches. And protest politics...
Why don't you think that he can... I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Conway. Why do you say that you don't think that he can actually be an effective leader for the Labour Party?
Because I don't think the British public will buy his brand of politics. I mean, it's a genuine brand of politics, but it's utterly wrong. And you just have to look at the state of Venezuela to realize how wrong it is. So it's a nice thought, and it's all very happy thoughts that, you know, we could just spend more money out of a cloud somewhere and everybody would be happy ever after. But of course, life doesn't work out like that.
Okay.
And the danger for the Labour Party is they were wiped out in Scotland, which George knows as a Scot was so strongly Labour. And the fear for them now is that, you know, UKIP, the UKIP Independent Party, which is a horrible bunch of people, could do the same to them in the Labour heartlands of England.
Okay. What about that, Mr. Galloway? Comments by Mr. Conway. Do you think that Jeremy Corbyn could not actually lead the UK? The people are not ready to accept him?
No, I don't accept that at all. Labour is ahead of the Conservative Party in the opinion polls, and 9 months into Corbyn's leadership, and given the sabotage from within and the intense hostility of the media, that's a remarkable thing. The 4 parliamentary by-elections that I talked of were in the very places, the very heartlands that Derek thinks are imperiled by UKIP. Scotland was lost by the previous leader, not by Jeremy Corbyn, and was lost by Blairism. The Blairites are controlling this coup. It's true what Derek says, that some of them are, many of them actually, came into Parliament after Blair had lost power. But the controlling group that is organising all of this is Blair, Mandelson, and Alistair Campbell, the spin doctor in chief of Tony Blair, public relations companies that are closely associated with them and indeed employing some of them on vast salaries and fees. It's very clear that the Blairites are the spider at the center of the web, even if the web further out are people who perhaps have never even met Tony Blair. So Labour's ahead in the polls. They've won every election that's been put up in front of them. Corbyn's leadership has spontaneously now generated hundreds of thousands of new members to the Labour Party. The party has more than doubled in size, and it's more than double the size of the Conservative Party. The trade unions are wholly behind Jeremy Corbyn, and the Tories are in a mess. And if they elect any of the rather small, dwarfish figures that are now running for the Tory leadership, they will lose still more of their luster.
Okay.
But there is one thing that neither Derek nor I did mention. The people in Britain are increasingly less divided on the traditional party lines. Those party lines have blurred, so that, for example, the victory for Brexit in the referendum was won by roughly 40% of Labour voters voting Leave and a clear majority of Conservative voters voting Leave, despite the fact that the leadership of both Labour and the Conservatives were calling on them to vote Remain.
Okay.
So things are not as clear-cut as they were in the decades that Derek and I faced each other across the chamber of the House of Commons.
Well, let me get Derek Conway back in on that. What about that, Mr. Conway, the comments that Mr. Galloway has made about not just voting according to party lines? If we're looking at the Labour Party and the massive amount of support, again, by the members and how the party has grown, it would seem that there is definitely a movement or type of support for the Labour Party, for the Corbyns, those who are supporting Corbyn. Do you not see, or do you not think that this is a trend and it is significant, what we're seeing in the last couple of weeks?
I think part of the problem is I'm a very traditional, sort of unimaginative ex-politician, and I'd listen to things that George would say, as he said on this program, and think, well, that's not very realistic. But the fact is, George has continued to confound political expectations. He stood in elections when I said, George Galloway has got a chance of winning this. It's just not going to happen. And he's defied them by actually winning. So sometimes when you hear people like George come out with observations that you might think, well, that's a bit off the wall. I mean, he defies it by winning popular support. So he knows how to win elections. And it's winning elections that is critical to this, because to win an election, you not only have to get the people who think you're good and support your party, you've got to get the people who aren't so sure and can swing either way. And the problem I think the Labour Party has under Jeremy Corbyn is that I think the mainstream Labour Party member will support him and think he's wonderful, and that bedrock of support will turn out for him. But to get into number 10, as Tony Blair showed and as David Cameron showed, you've got to tack to the centre. And this is all horrible stuff to people like George and I have got strong views on things, but it's just the mechanics of the way the first past the post electoral system works in Britain. You've got to get more people than support your core ideology to vote for you. Otherwise, you just become perhaps a bigger opposition, but still an opposition. You don't get your hands on the levers of power.
Okay, what about that, Mr. Galloway? Is it that perhaps Jeremy Corbyn cannot appeal more to the centrists?
Well, Derek's absolutely right, of course, but I think that events are moving on. I gave the example of the Brexit vote. This was a rejection by the have-nots, principally. 17,200,000 people voted against the power of big business, the big banks, the big media, the big parties, the big newspapers. 17 million, the biggest vote ever assembled in Britain for anything, rejected it, even though all of the prevailing orthodoxy was against it. There's a revolt going on. And by the way, not just in Britain. In the United States, the rise of Bernie Sanders, and even, I'm sorry to say, the other side of that coin, the rise of Donald Trump. All of these things seem to indicate to me that what was solid before is melting into air, and that things are changing. The times, they are a-changing. But of course, Jeremy Corbyn has some weaknesses. I often wish that I could somehow transmit my thoughts on that to him while he's giving speeches or asking questions in the House of Commons. Yes, that's true. But there's nobody better than him on offer in the Labour Party leadership challenge. If there was another Tony Blair who hadn't invaded Iraq, who hadn't killed 1 million people, who hadn't done this, that, and the next thing, there was a clean hand in the House of Commons that was a better, more polished a more persuasive performer than Jeremy Corbyn, then I think things might be slightly different, but there isn't.
Okay.
The person who's going to run against Jeremy Corbyn is less charismatic. She voted for the war on Iraq. She voted for university tuition fees. She voted against the Chilcot inquiry into the war on Iraq being set up. She has a long track record of supporting the very policies that destroyed the Labour Party in government. And by the way, she's less charismatic than him. She's a poorer speaker than him. And she's a poorer parliamentary performer than him.
Okay, all right,
And
stay
as
with me,
Derek
George
knows,
Galloway, stay with me. Let me get Derek
You can only
Conway.
pick from what's in front of you.
Let me get Derek Conway back in on this. You wanted to, I saw you made a comment, Derek. Derek,
Well, I mean, George is saying about the 17 million who voted to leave the EU, and I was one of the 17 million, wicked representative of the capitalist system that I am. But of course, Jeremy Corbyn campaigned to stay in the European Union, so I'm not sure where George would put him in claiming to have the will of popular support. And I think he's probably being a little bit harsh on Angela Eagle, who is avowedly on the soft left of the Labour Party. As an instinctive conservative, I wouldn't regard Angela Eagle as a safe pair of hands, whereas undoubtedly to many conservatives, Tony Blair and David Cameron were almost interchangeable in their attitude to life and their attitude to politics. So I'd accept George's position probably that Tony Blair was a sort of conservative in a conservative cloak. But I think the Labour Parliamentary Party has moved on from that. But if it wants to be the majority party in the House of Commons, then it's going to have someone who the British public takes to more than just their own supporters.
Well, let me just jump in here, Derek Conway. When you say about the British public, sorry to interrupt, when you talk about the British public, do you not think that there is sort of a switch, as George Galloway was saying, when we look at the 17 million who voted and we look at the breakdown of the vote for the Brexit, it was more a vote against anti-big business, anti-corporation, anti-corporate banking. Do you not see a change perhaps in the public will in general?
I think there was more concern about the levels of immigration than there were concerns about the power of corporate banking expressed in the popular opinion. Although I agree with George, I mean, he and I would agree completely about the discrepancy between the rewards of the sort of top bankers and top chief executives of global companies and the ordinary working person. So I don't think that wasn't an issue so much in the European Union campaign. Although I was personally very glad because of the outcome. And I think the reason that people like Jeremy Corbyn were eventually persuaded after thought he was, again, in favour of coming out of the EU. But I think he was probably persuaded to stay in it because it makes being a member of the European Union makes it more difficult to implement the sort of agenda that Jeremy and maybe George would like, the sort of renationalisation of major public services like the railway and water and gas and energy and all that. Can't be done if you're a member of the European Union, whereas it can be done if you're an independent nation. And that's probably why Jeremy supported that thought throughout his political career, but for whatever reason, changed his mind during that recent campaign to support, as George would have it, the global bankers. So there is a lot of confusion as Jeremy is coming to terms with being in power. Personally, I don't think he'll survive. The weekend reports here in Britain have been that Unite, a big trade union in Britain, its membership is starting to say we can't win with Jeremy. And there are signs that members of the Labour Party themselves are beginning to have doubts. I hope they don't change their mind. I'm with George. I would like to see Jeremy Corbyn survive, because if he does, that will ensure another 5 years of a Conservative government. So he and I are completely on the same page over this, because Jeremy Corbyn simply will not win the next general election in Britain any more than Ed Miliband was capable of winning the last one.
All right, let me get George Galloway back in on this. Mr. Galloway, your take. Do you think that Corbyn will be able to survive?
Oh, I'm certain that he will. Hundreds of thousands of new members have joined the Labour Party since he was elected, and they didn't join because they didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. 60,000 joined in 4 days last week, 60,000, and they didn't join to vote against Jeremy Corbyn. So I'm certain that he will, unless he's broken as a man by the ferocious, foul, vile assault that has been levelled against him by the media and by his own colleagues. Now, on the EU point, Jeremy Corbyn was all of his political life against the EU because he and I are both followers of the late Mr. Benn, Tony Benn. And Jeremy didn't change his mind. Indeed, one of the pretexts for this coup is that he was not enthusiastic enough in campaigning for remaining in the EU. And if that's true, then that shows that his actual instincts were closer to the instincts of the majority of the British people than were the Remain campaigners.
He publicly argued to remain, George. You know he did. He publicly argued. You know, George, that he publicly argued to remain. That was his public position.
And I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry that he did. No, that's true, Derek. But I believe that he sounded like a hostage reading the demands of his kidnapper throughout the campaign.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us and look at the Labour Party in the UK. Former British MP George Galloway out of London and former British MP Derek Conway out of Newcastle. And as always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marcia Hashemi signing out for myself and other group right here in Tehran. Goodbye.